Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mystic Artistry Podcast. This is Susan, and I am grateful you are here. Today's reflection touches on some tender territory, but it's really about compassion for ourselves, for our nervous systems, and for the ways we learn to survive difficult experiences. Over the years, I've noticed something about the ways human beings cope with pain. Sometimes, when we remove one coping mechanism from our lives, another one quietly appears. It may look different on the surface, but underneath, it's often serving the same purpose, trying to soothe something inside us that still hurts. The nervous system is always searching for relief. Today's reflection comes from my own experience and patterns I've noticed in my own life. It's not a clinical conversation, and I am not here to diagnose anyone. It's simply an honest reflection about how trauma, coping, and the body become intertwined. And my hope is that by speaking about it gently, someone listening might feel a little less alone. For as long as I can remember, my relationship with food has been very complicated. When I look back now with the perspective of adulthood, I can see that some of those patterns began very early in my life after trauma I experienced as a child. I was molested when I was young, and as my body began to grow and change, something inside me wanted to stop that process. I wanted to halt the development that suddenly made my body feel safe. Of course, as a child, I didn't understand any of this. All I knew was that controlling my body somehow felt like protection. There was also an irony in my life that I can see clearly now. I grew up in a family that was in the food industry. We were what you would call a family of food lovers, people who truly appreciated meals, flavors, and the joy of sharing food together. And yet, there I was, becoming increasingly determined not to eat. In those days, people didn't really understand eating disorders the way they do now. My parents were understandably terrified, watching me disappear into nothingness. They did what they thought was the right thing and brought me to a pediatrician for help. Unfortunately, he didn't understand it either. Instead of helping, he handled the situation very poorly. I remember him mocking me for wearing a bra and calling me names in a way that only deepened the shame I was already feeling. Looking back now, I realize how much misunderstanding surrounded this issue in those days, even among professionals. And experiences like that can make it even harder for a young person to feel safe in their own body. Years later, I can see that food was never really the issue. The issue was the nervous system trying to cope with something overwhelming. And over time, I've come to realize something important. Pain often changes its disguise. One person may cope through alcohol, another through control around food. Someone else might throw themselves completely into work or perfectionism. On the surface, these behaviors look very different, but underneath, the nervous system is often trying to do the same thing. It's trying to soothe something that still hurts. Even today, my relationship with food is something I have to stay aware of. I'm currently trying to lose some weight in a healthy way, but I know myself well enough to recognize how easily that old all or nothing thinking can creep back in. That voice that says things have to be perfect, or that if you slip a little, everything is ruined. I've learned to watch for that pattern very carefully because slipping back into that mindset can happen quietly and it's not always easy. I've discovered over time that many of these patterns live in what I would call reactivity. The body remembers old ways of protecting itself, and sometimes those reactions happen very quickly, almost automatically. You feel an emotion, you feel discomfort, you feel the urge to control something. And before you even realize what's happening, the old pattern is already knocking at that door. For a long time, I thought the goal was to eliminate those impulses entirely. But I don't think that's how healing works. The impulses may still appear from time to time because they were once part of how we survived something difficult. What we can learn, though, is how to pause. That pause may only last a few seconds, but sometimes those few seconds are where healing begins. A breath, a moment of awareness, a chance to choose something kinder for ourselves. That small moment of awareness between the impulse and the action can change everything. Instead of reacting automatically, we give ourselves the chance to breathe, to notice what's happening inside us, and to choose something different. For me, that pause often happens through creativity, through sound, through music, through art, through spending time in nature. And sometimes it's even simpler than that. I will often find myself hugging a tree, something that might sound a little unusual to some people, but I find it incredibly soothing and affirming. There is something about touching the living world that reminds the body it is safe, that it is part of something steady and grounded. And in those quiet moments, the nervous system begins to soften again. Nature has a rhythm that the nervous system understands. Trees don't rush. The wind doesn't argue with itself. The earth simply continues breathing, slowly and steadily. And sometimes when we pause long enough to feel that rhythm again, our own bodies remember how to soften. The pause becomes the doorway to a different response. There's another piece of this that I think is important to talk about, and that is shame. Sometimes these coping patterns show up in ways that look very different on the surface, and they tend to grow in the quiet soil of shame. For some people, it may be alcohol. For others, it may be control around food. For someone else, it might be compulsive work or constant busyness or seeking comfort through relationships or sexuality or substances. On the outside, these behaviors can appear unrelated, but underneath, the nervous system is often trying to do the same thing. It's trying to soothe something that hurts. Pain has a remarkable way of changing its disguise. The behavior may change, but the need underneath it is often the same. The nervous system is searching for relief, for safety, for some way to quiet the storm inside. When something painful happens in our lives, especially early in life, we often don't have the language to understand it. Instead, we internalize it. We begin to believe, somewhere deep inside, that something about us is wrong. And when shame enters the picture, it becomes much harder to talk about what we're experiencing. So, We hide. We try to manage the feeling privately, and sometimes the behaviors we develop are simply attempts to cope with emotions that feel too overwhelming to face directly. For many years, I carried a great deal of shame around my relationship with food and my body. But over time, I've learned something important. Shame rarely heals anything, compassion does. The more gently we can look at the patterns we carry, not with judgment, but with curiosity and kindness, the more space we create for real change to happen. Something healing begins with something as simple as saying to ourselves, "Ah, I see what my nervous system is trying to do," and meeting that moment with patience instead of punishment. At some point in my life, I began to realize something important. The patterns I had spent so many years fighting were not really my enemies. They were attempts, sometimes imperfect attempts, by my nervous system to protect me. For a long time, I thought healing meant conquering those patterns, of forcing them to disappear. But over time, I began to see them differently. They were signals, messages from a younger part of myself that had been trying very hard to survive something it did not understand. And when I began to look at those patterns with compassion instead of judgment, something inside me felt relief. That doesn't mean the impulses never appear, but it does mean I can meet them with awareness. And sometimes that awareness is enough to create space for a different choice. I think many of us are carrying patterns that once helped us survive something difficult. Sometimes healing begins the moment we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What was my nervous system trying to protect?" There's another way this understanding has shown up in my life. As I've come to understand these patterns with more compassion, something else from my past has come back to mind. Many years ago, I wrote a song called "Little Girl." I haven't looked at the lyrics in a long time, but I can still hear pieces of it in my mind. The song came from this feeling that the woman I would eventually become wished she could somehow go back and stand beside that little girl. I remember the line went something like this: "Little girl, are you listening? Are your eyes still glistening?" I think in many ways that's what healing can look like. The woman we've become learning how to care for the little girl we once were. And in many ways, I think healing sometimes looks like that. Becoming the compassionate presence for ourselves that we needed back then. It's a sweet idea that somehow the wiser, older self could stand beside that younger version of ourselves and say, "Hey, you're not alone anymore." When I wrote that song, I think part of me was beginning to understand something important: that healing isn't about erasing the past. Sometimes it is about becoming the kind of presence for ourselves that we needed back then: the protector, the comforter, the steady voice that says, "I'm here, you're safe." I believe many of us are carrying patterns that once helped us survive something very difficult. And those patterns deserve compassion, even when we're trying to change them. Healing, I've learned, is not about punishing ourselves into perfection. It is about awareness, about pausing, and learning gentler ways to care for ourselves. Sometimes that care comes through music, through art, through nature, through the quiet moments where we remember to breathe. And sometimes healing looks like the woman we've become, quietly reaching back with kindness toward the little girl we once were, to reassure her that she made it, that she survived, and that she is no longer alone. And perhaps in that moment, we realize we aren't alone either. If today's reflection spoke to you, you're always welcome to share your thoughts or experiences with me. I truly value hearing from you. And if this reflection resonates with you, feel free to share it with someone who might need a little compassion today. Until next time, may you find moments of stillness, creativity, and kindness, both for yourself and for the world around you. And as always, I'm listening.